Hello again, everybody. It's Colin Talbot again, talking about how governments are responding to the COVID crisis. We've done quite a few on this series looking at other countries. We're going to take a more internal focus for this one on the UK, and I'm glad to be joined by three people from the three devolved areas of the UK. Nicola McEwen from Scotland, Quinton Oliver from Northern Ireland, and Leighton Andrews from Wales. And we're going to talk about how their administrations have responded, and also about the relationship between their administrations and the UK government. So if people would just introduce themselves, that would be useful. Quinton, you want to go first?
Sure. My name's Quinton Oliver. I've lived and worked in Northern Ireland during the peace process of the Troubles, and since then trying to build a participative democracy here. So the COVID-19 crisis has been an amazing test of that delicate, fragile politics that we've developed here in Northern Ireland, split between United Irelanders and UK Unionists.
Thanks. Nicola?
Hi, I'm Nicola McEwen. I'm a professor of territorial politics at the University of Edinburgh. So I specialise in devolution and intergovernmental relations, and this particular crisis has been given interesting insights into that process.
Leighton.
I'm Leighton Andrews. I'm a professor in the Cardiff Business School, professor in public leadership. Before coming back to academia, I was minister in the Welsh Government, where I was Minister for Education and Skills and then Minister for Public Services. Behind me you can see the Cardiff City Football Stadium, which is currently a testing centre for COVID-19.
Thanks very much. Okay, well, I think we could start with just trying to establish the context for people who are not familiar with the devolution settlements in the United Kingdom. We're getting quite an international audience for these sessions, so it'd be useful to explain from people from outside the UK, and probably some inside the UK, particularly in England, what the devolution settlements are in each area. And also maybe if we could just say something about how bad the COVID outbreak's been in the three countries. That would be quite useful. So Leighton, would you like to go first for this one?
Okay, I mean, in Wales, I guess the principal services that are affected as devolved services are health and education. We don't have the devolution of policing to Wales, so although separate laws have been passed in Wales in relation to social distancing, for example, which are regulated by the police, as it were, there is a mixed blend there of accountabilities, I suppose, in that process. In health terms, I think the objectives were similar to those in other parts of the UK, which was to protect the capacity of the National Health Service. Currently, I think we have managed to double the number of beds in critical care. About half of those are currently occupied. Additional hospitals have been brought on stream. As of today's figures, sadly 908 people have died of COVID, and we currently have around 980 people in hospital with COVID symptoms, which is, I think, a 3-week low, in fact. I think it's maybe the first time since it's dipped below 1,000 cases in hospitals in Wales. Wales took a decision, announced the decision early that schools would be closing, and that's obviously been a significant factor, but like most of the UK, it was around the third week of March that everybody started to social distance and really operate from home.
All right, thanks. Nicola, would you like to?
Yes. So in Scotland, very similar in a sense to Wales, but with the additional devolved responsibilities over policing and justice issues. So as well as cooperating with the UK legislation and supporting legislative consent, motions for the UK legislation, which all of the devolved legislators did. There was also emergency legislation introduced in Scotland for supporting public services, for making some radical changes to things like protection for workers, for providing additional support for businesses, and changing some elements of the criminal justice system. And so a lot of that has had quite strong cross-party support to date, and there has been quite a deliberate and explicit effort on the part of what is a pro-independence government in Scotland to work collaboratively with the other administrations and to try to explicitly assert that it is doing so where it sees it's in everyone's interest. It's trying not to have distinctive policies unless it feels it's necessary to do so. I think what we've seen more recently is a bit more willingness to be distinctive, to take distinctive positions for Scotland, where the First Minister in particular, who's been very much at the front of the communications message within Scotland, where she sees it as in Scotland's interest to do so. And that started to create a little bit of tension, perhaps a little bit of divisions within the parties, sort of trying to test that cross-party consensus that we have seen so far. And we also see that emerging in terms of the policy implementation itself. The Scottish Government has done, I think, pretty well in terms of responding to the challenges, particularly in hospitals, in the NHS, where it is being challenged more. Indeed, I think this is true of all of the administrations, is in response to the crisis in care and social care, both in terms of residential care homes, but also in terms of care workers providing personal care in people's homes. So I think they would admit that that hasn't been as successful, but I think it's clearly top of all of the government's agendas now.
Okay, Quinton.
Well, like Scotland, we have almost everything devolved, including policing. We have a very fragile coalition government, and that is relevant in that they were off for 3 years and only just came back in January. It's got 5 parties in it who haven't worked together over those 3 years. And because of our land border with the very different jurisdiction of Ireland, and because of the Brexit overlay and that debate in the last 3 years, it's been particularly fractious. So our joint head of government, the Deputy First Minister from Sinn Féin, has been publicly criticising her partners in government, and she sits around the cabinet table with them. And when she wants to, she goes outside and condemns following Boris Johnson's diktats, for example. So that creates a very fractious political argument. Is Ireland doing better than the UK? Why aren't we following Ireland? Why are we slavishly following UK rules? And that makes it very hard for the public administration, who have held us together during the conflict pretty well by being solid and dull. But a crisis like this isn't always well served by solid and dull. Remarkably, we've actually done very well statistically. So we only have 350 deaths with all the qualifications and how you measure deaths and so forth, is probably the best across these islands. Although even that is hotly contested as to whether we're 50% worse than the Republic or not. So there are statisticians with unionist or nationalist perspectives arguing that out. We were, in a way, partially saved from the worst of it by being on an island and a small part of the UK. Ironically, the collapse of Flybe in early March is attributed with having delayed a lot of movement of people in and out, and therefore came ironically just at the right time.
Can I just clarify for people listening that Flybe's was a small regional airline that mainly did internal flights within the UK, and it collapsed as a service. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Quinton.
Yeah, and therefore our air and sea links with the UK have been easier to control and manage, and therefore the spread has possibly been easier to control and manage. Our debate of last week was about access to cemeteries, which has a particular political connotation here in terms of which cemetery and where it is. And because we have the land border with a different jurisdiction, we have a sort of reverse COVID tourism, where day trippers from the north are not subject to the southern stronger restrictions on movement. So in the south, they had a 2-kilometre bar, which made it very simple. You could not exercise or go for essential things or anything beyond 2 kilometres. But that doesn't apply to northerners who cross the border.
Yeah, I mean that whole border issue is fascinating. I heard a item on BBC Radio last week with your First Minister, and that the entire item managed to discuss Northern Ireland without once mentioning the border, which I was just completely fascinated by. And obviously there are already a lot of biosecurity arrangements because of agricultural production in the north and the south of the island of Ireland, and that seems to be quite a big issue that doesn't apply to anywhere else in the UK.
Yes, and we get the downdraft of the Brexit discussions because over 3 years the Irish problem was one of the blockages for the Brexit debate, and now that's being played out in this argument as well. About the movement of people and the disease and ideas, and do we keep our common travel area because that's an important political principle of our European debate, or do we close it down because there is a health scare? So the police in the north are having particular difficulty, partly because they're still not fully accepted in one community, and we still have political violence. We've had a murder a couple of weeks ago during lockdown in a garden in North Belfast. So the police have extra special difficulties to manage.
One thing I think just important to mention from what all three of you have said for people watching this who are not familiar with the devolution arrangements inside the UK, which is, if it's not already obvious, that they're very different across the three areas that we're talking about. Some powers are devolved in Northern Ireland policing and in Scotland policing, for example, that aren't devolved in Wales. Similarly around prisons, and a whole range of other issues. And the assemblies and the Scottish Parliament themselves are very different sorts of structures in the three areas. So it's not like it's some sort of federal system where they're all more or less the same, which I think is important to note. I wonder if we could just turn to the overall health response in the three areas. I mean, I think all three of you have said that to a large extent it's mirrored what's gone on in England. But I wonder just how far that's true, and are there areas of difference? I think there have been one or two beginning to emerge, particularly in Scotland more recently, between the Scottish administration and the Westminster government. So I wonder if we could start with Nicola about that, because there's been, I think, a few flashpoints.
Yes. So sorry, I didn't mention the figures, the latest figures from Scotland in the introduction there today, and announced that the latest figures are just under 1,500 deaths by the measure that is used across the UK. But every time the First Minister announces those, she always qualifies it by saying they think that's an underestimate, because obviously the figures depend on how you measure and how you report them.
Sorry, can I just ask, are they still using the deaths in hospital figure then? As the
No,
main one?
I think they also use care home as reported deaths to the registrar. I'm pretty sure is the figure. So it's as a result of tests.
Right.
But I don't think it is just exclusive to hospitals. But one of the differences that has emerged this week, for example, and interestingly, it did raise some border issues here as well, was in relation to advice about wearing of masks. So the Scottish government have now advised people to wear non-medical, non-surgical masks when they are in supermarkets and in shops in small enclosed areas where it might be difficult to maintain social distancing. They haven't enforced it. They have issued it as guidance, but it's notably distinctive from the guidance. It's not issued as guidance by the UK government. And so there were some concerns from MPs from the Borders area in particular, including a former Secretary of State for Scotland, about the confusion that may cause for people crossing the borders. There might be elements of confusion there, but I think it's also a reflection of the way that politics is starting to creep into this, and any deviation from an all UK wide message is being seen through the lens of constitutional politics within Scotland, which so dominates pretty much everything that we talk about in Scotland these days.
Yeah. Leighton, do you want to say something about what's been happening in Wales?
Yeah, broadly speaking, I think the Welsh Government will be pleased that its objectives have been met. I mean, acute care has not, critical care has not been overwhelmed. They're concerned that A&E attendance is down about 50% against what would normally be seen, and ambulance calls are down about 29%. So that's a general thing, I think, that's developing in conversations now probably across the UK. There have been some issues here about supply of PPE, but this week we saw PPE being flown in from Cambodia and China into Cardiff airport. And other stocks have been obtained from across the UK. Testing, there have been some differences, and this is coming out now, I think, between Wales and England. Wales is not going for the extent of testing in care homes and of over 65s that they're going ahead with in England, on the basis that if you were to do that in a meaningful way, you'd virtually be having to test every day. So there are some philosophical differences, I think, with England on that. There have been some issues about the reporting of deaths here. We've had two health boards which were clearly not reporting the figures to Public Health Wales in the same way as the other health boards, which meant that we've had a couple of days where there's been a catch-up on the number of deaths in the figures that have been produced. One of the areas I think that's interesting here in Wales is we've seen a very significant amount of encouragement to local companies to get involved in helping to develop PPE equipment, for example, shields, face shields, and also the less invasive kind of ventilators. Some of those have been trialled with support from the Welsh Government. And we've got quite strong rules in terms of social distancing within the workplace, which are set down in regulations from the Welsh Government. So that's been a significant difference, I think. There has been some tension with England, for example, just to give one simple example, when the online testing went live last week at a UK level, there were not advanced conversations with the devolved administrations, including Wales. So, our people didn't know that was going to happen in advance. And that's an example, I think, it's a very clear example of some of the failure to communicate across the different administrations. There are other examples as well, but I think that's the most obvious.
Yeah. Quinton, did you want to add anything about Northern Ireland in this respect, where obviously the politics is more difficult?
Sure, but also the public administration points. We've had a unified health and social care system for 50 years, and therefore shouldn't have had the difficulties that we hear in your various stages of integration across on your island, but we have. So effectively, the 50 years of integration has made no difference at all. And the same debates about care homes being abandoned, getting access to PPE, about the data collection, about the rules applying to them, about low-paid workers, immigrant workers, and so on, are all replicated across the two. So there's a big question there about why the care sector has been the very junior partner, even within an apparently integrated system. A couple of interesting anomalies have come up, like quite properly, the UK government has invited the devolved jurisdictions to join the COBRA meetings. And that means that Sinn Féin have attended their first ever UK government COBRA meeting, about which they were in the past the subject of discussion, active participants. And another anomaly is thrown up, and you may have seen at our First and Deputy First Minister press conferences, we have 2 sign language interpreters. And that's because it's emerged, for those who didn't know, that there is British Sign Language, mostly practiced by Protestants, and Irish Sign Language, which is a different sign language, still interpreting the English language. It doesn't interpret the Irish language, it interprets the English language. And therefore, we have had 2 signers at all the press conferences. So the administration has generally coped well, despite the political tensions, if the outcome results that we're seeing are continued.
That's interesting. Leighton, can I just ask you quickly, is that the translation issue for sign language the same in Wales?
Well, it's not featured in any of the discussions, but there is different sign. I mean,
yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Can I ask a general question about the degree to which the government's executives' response in the 3 areas has been fairly centralist? One of the things we've identified in England is that there's been a massive push to centralisation of everything. So, for example, Public Health England refused to let non-Public Health England labs do testing and insisted on setting up 3 new testing centres, including one in Glasgow, which was set up by, as far as I can make out, it's been set up by Public Health England or in some sort of weird cooperation arrangement. So we've only got 3 big testing labs now for testing all sorts of other things as well, like these Nightingale hospitals, big centralised initiatives. And local government playing a pretty low role in all of it. Now, I know local government plays a slightly different role in the 3 different countries. So I just wondered how far that's replicated in the 3 countries. Has there been a push towards more centralism? I know in Scotland, for example, that's been going on for a while around a number of issues, like the centralisation of the police forces in Scotland. So maybe Nicola, if you want to come in first.
Yeah, I mean, there has been a long-running debate around what you call centralisation and what someone else might call integration.
Right.
But I mean, it hasn't been raised as an issue here, is what I would say. My sense is that things are very much coordinated by the Scottish Government. The offers of help, for example, I noted that all of that is being centralised in terms of government, and that's partly because they want to ensure that there are minimum standards that are met before things are distributed to local authorities. So they're asking so there's a centralised volunteer service as well. So it's I think an effort to coordinate rather than control, but it hasn't so far been raised as a difficult issue in the way that, you know, some of the earlier debates around public service centralisation / integration have been. I think there's broadly been sympathy for that.
Leighton, what about Wales?
I think there are 2 issues here of centralisation versus decentralisation. I think the first is UK procured services versus devolved services, and then there's the issue of decentralisation within Wales. So you can see behind me, as I said at the beginning, the Cardiff City Stadium. Now, there was a contract, as I understand it, through which Deloitte was given the right to create 50 or so testing centres across the UK. And we knew that the Cardiff City Stadium was going to be used as a testing centre for a number of days. It was mentioned in Welsh Government briefings. But then an organisation called the UK Government in Wales, formerly known as the Wales Office, tweeted about its opening. So there's a kind of, determined attempt, I think, to demonstrate within Wales that the UK government is playing a role here. Michael Gove had an article in one of the newspapers here last week talking about the money coming to Wales in consequentials as a result of the Chancellor's statement. So there's an active, I think, political process of trying to demonstrate that the UK government has a role in this devolved part of the UK. The second is within Wales. I think there's been a genuine attempt by the Welsh Government to work with local government in a number of areas. So additional money, for example, was found for adult social care, about 40 million. Additional money was put into free school meals so that local authorities could continue a free school meals service in a number of different ways, maybe with vouchers or putting money into people's bank accounts or home food deliveries. And Wales there's been more investment in combating rough sleeping in Wales per head of population than there has been in England. That's been done with local authorities. And the planning function of local authorities has been supported in terms of the development of new hospitals. They were given the powers to process planning applications for those faster, for example. So I think there's been an attempt at partnership.
Right. What about Northern Ireland, Quinton? I know local government plays a very different role.
Our local government is and still remains a very junior partner because it hasn't yet been given back education or housing or social work. So it deals with graveyards, which are particularly important at the moment, leisure centres that are all closed but are potentially places for keeping bodies if they're needed. And therefore, Northern Ireland is probably small enough not to suffer that because Stormont is in everyone's vision, which is the seat of the Northern Ireland government, and because we're a smaller community that has probably worked well for us in that when decisions are made, they're quickly passed to the ground up. There's been some unseemly competition about the role of the Irish government, of course, because in PPE procurement, for example, they've tried the UK system, but they've also tried the Irish system, and therefore there was some competition about who could get the Chinese companies to send it to Dublin and then Northern Ireland rather than send it to London. So I think that'll come out in the wash that the procurement based on a just-in-time model on a global supply system that's collapsed has led to a lot of really unpleasant and unsavoury competition that hasn't served the people or the governments particularly well.
I wonder if we could just, as a final round, an issue is look at the issue of government communications and leadership, and the things like the daily press briefings that have been held. I mean, there's been a lot of international debate in this, and we've seen some quite extraordinary variations from people like Bolsonaro in Brazil, who seems to say, so what, people are dying, it's not my problem, I'm the president, through to Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who's been getting enormous praise for the sort of level of communication she's been doing to the people of New Zealand, who seem to have done incredibly well in terms of suppressing the outbreak. So I just wondered if we could say something about what's been going on. I know there've been some comments about Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, but I've heard very little from Wales and Northern Ireland about how well the governments have been doing in terms of communications. Do you want to go first on Scotland, Nicola?
Sure. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon, as First Minister, has been very much at the forefront of the communication strategy in Scotland, with daily press briefings supported by her medical team, medical advisors, but also relevant ministers. But she's very much the face of the government anyway, but particularly during this crisis, and she's very, very good at it. And I think that's probably helped to reinforce, I think, within a lot of the media coverage within Scotland, that the Scottish Government is at the centre of that. It's not an add-on, it's not a bit player, it's at the centre of it. And it's impossible to know whether this, I guess, some of the difficulties in communication at the UK government level and the absence, the necessary absence for quite a long time of the Prime Minister from that may have contributed to that. But I think also the First Minister is very well known. Her resonates, her message, her voice resonates quite widely, and there are trust issues that I think for the devolved governments generally, they tend to have higher levels of trust among the public in the relevant territories than does the UK government. So I think that trust in communication and the communicator has been quite important. And so I think, if anything, her authority is likely to have been restored from this so far, but there are obviously difficult questions to answer later on.
Thanks. Leighton, would you like to say something about Wales?
Well, the Welsh, yes, the National Assembly has been sitting virtually throughout most of this period. So it's not simply been simply a question of government press conferences. It's also been a question of formal statements by the First Minister, by the Health Minister, by the Education Minister, and others. And so there's been a process of political accountability here, which I think has been less evident at the UK level. I think that the nature of the crisis has played quite well to the strengths of the First Minister, Mark Drakeford. He comes across, he's a former professor in social work. He's been the Health Minister in the past. He's calm, he's collected, he's reasoned in his approach to questions. And he's made a genuine attempt also to bring the other political parties within the National Assembly into discussions, which doesn't mean, of course, that there haven't been criticisms of performance of the Welsh Government in certain areas, mainly on specifics rather than in terms of advanced planning at this stage at any rate. I think we have a different media situation to that in Scotland. I mean, the UK media, particularly newspapers, really does penetrate Wales very significantly. And so the London UK agenda really does come home here in Wales, and in a sense cuts across to a degree Welsh government communications, I think. I would say that Welsh journalists on the whole, I think, in terms of the press conferences that I've seen, have done a better and more determined job at holding the Welsh government to account than UK journalists have done of holding the UK government to account.
Thanks, that's very interesting. Quinton, Northern Ireland.
Yes, we're led by two women, First and Deputy First Minister, but they're polar opposites politically and in terms of their style. So they have done the joint press conference with breathtaking ability to give different messages in this same press conference. They differed over schools and should they be opened, and essential workers going to schools needs facilities. They've differed over a particular carpet factory as to whether that was an essential business or it couldn't do social distancing at the machines, therefore it should be closed. They've differed over off licenses and whether that was essential. They've differed over cemeteries and whether the rules could be relaxed, which they were. Sinn Féin turned turtle on that and consented to cemeteries being relaxed legislatively. And today's argument is over churches. So it was a DUP minister broke ranks and argued that churches should be reopened before the executive had decided it. But despite that, and in a way it's because we're used to it, you could argue it actually almost strengthens the public debate that we're not being told by a centralist broadcasting government that we must wrestle this mugger to the ground, which is such an unhelpful metaphor. We are being warmed up by our divided politicians who clearly have such a personal commitment to do the best they can, and therefore it has a strange unifying effect. The Welsh and I differ about where we want to be at the end of this. We consent to lockdown and to the restrictions pretty well. So it has some fascinating paradoxes of communication and a political difference.
That's really interesting. Thank you. You may be interested to note when I did the interview with colleagues in New Zealand that there they've set up within Parliament, they set up an emergency committee which is chaired by a member of the opposition party, which is coordinating very closely with the government and at the same time scrutinising exactly what the executive's doing, which I think is fairly unique as an innovation. I'm not sure anywhere else.
The Scottish Parliament is the Scottish Parliament is setting up a COVID committee as well to scrutinise government. And
is that chaired by the SNP or by?
I don't know if they've appointed members yet. I'd be surprised if it was, but yeah, it's an interesting innovation anyway, and merited, I think.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I think we're coming towards the end. Is there anything that we've missed out that any of you want to raise, either specifically for your own countries or more generally? Leighton, you're indicating.
I think we tend to think of the UK government as being in the driving seat in terms of the economic response. But the Welsh government, one of the things they've done is create a £500 million economic resilience fund. Which means additional kinds of support available to small and medium enterprises over and above what is available from the UK government through business rates relief and other things. And that's meant, and I think they've released already £300 million of that £500 million fund. Now that, I think, to a degree draws on some of the measures that were undertaken in Wales in terms of thinking about the response to the financial crisis a decade or so back and having those direct mechanisms. But I think, although we think about the economic response as a non-devolved activity, in fact, devolved administrations are playing their part in the economic recovery as well.
Thank you. Nicola.
Yeah, sorry, just to update, I just checked, and that committee, the COVID committee, is indeed chaired by a Conservative member, and the deputy convener is a Labour member. So yeah, it's just been up and running for a little while. The point I wanted to make was about intergovernmental relations. And although Leighton and Quinton and I have mentioned some tensions emerging, and there's clearly been a little bit of difficulty here and there, I think perhaps more remarkable is the extent to which they have been able to collaborate. And this is in light, building on a very recent experience where relationships have been pretty dire, actually, in relation to the Brexit process. And so they weren't starting from a great base, and yet they're, yes, with some tensions, and yes, there may be more of that further down the line, and we might learn more about it in due course as well. But if you compare that to some other intergovernmental relations in some other countries, in Spain, for example, where relationships are awful, in the United States, where we've seen very visible protests and disagreements between the states, the governors and the White House. So I think it's not that bad in the UK. And so I think there's some positives to take from that as well.
There will be a public inquiry after all this. And this will be the first meaningful public inquiry in the UK where the existence of the devolved administrations will make a difference on a UK basis. And that's where we might see some of those different perspectives coming out subsequently, I suspect.
Yes, I think it has tested the social contract, but broadly across the four, the social contract has weathered it, in that this worst thing that a government can do is deprive you of your liberty. And so you have to win agreement that a lockdown and you will confine yourself does require a real confidence and trust. And if you look at it just as we're talking, I mean, we have 5 political parties in government. We've got a different one in Scotland, different one in Wales, a different one in London. And I think Nicola's right. Perhaps the story is that they have differed, but broadly gone in the same direction and won incredible public support to do what appears to have been necessary. Now, the big challenge now is how they can ease the restrictions in a credible, manageable way that doesn't jeopardize the pain that has gone through all 4 parts of the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for that. That's fascinating insights and really, really interesting. I've learned lots from that. So thank you all for joining me today. I hope this will be up online within an hour or so. And you can use it with whoever you want to. So thanks very much, and I'm sure we'll talk again in the not too distant future.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.